My name's Tim Malone, and I'm a retired history teacher, American history. I taught American history for 25 years at Elgin Community College. And here we are today in Big Thunder Park, across the street from the Boone County Courthouse in Boone County, Illinois. And we're in front of the Civil War monument in Big Thunder Park to the men from Boone County who fought in the Civil War. Now, the Civil War, of course, is considered a triumph for democracy. That's the term we're going to use today. We're going to talk about today. The history of democracy. Is there any word that's more important in describing the United States of America than democracy? I think not. Democracy, that's what we're supposed to be, a democracy. And indeed, the foreign policy of the United States over many years has been explicitly to export democracy to the rest of the world. We're not only supposed to have it here, Americans are supposed to think that it should be everywhere. Universal democracy around the world. That's what we stand for. So, what does democracy mean? Such an important word? What does it mean? Well, I always, I have peers who wonder about my reliance upon dictionaries, but the dictionary's definition of democracy, almost all dictionary definitions of democracy include the idea that it's a government. That's the superior category. Democracy is a type of government by the people. By the people. Now, of course, if that's the definition of democracy, very quickly, who are the people? Government by the people. Who are the people? It's an important question in any democracy. Now, there's a point I'd like to make about democracy. The meaning of the word has changed over the years, over the span of American history. It's not unlike a lot of global terms: socialism, capitalism, authoritarianism. Their meanings change. They're huge concepts, and their meanings change. And this is, I think, one of the most important points about democracy in America that a lot of Americans, in my opinion, don't get. And that is that through most of its history, the United States was not a democracy as we define the term today. It doesn't come up to the meaning of the term today, democracy. Right now, we're in the midst of an election. And I want to emphasize that when you talk about the meaning of democracy, you quickly get to the idea of elections. In fact, you could put an equal sign between democracy and elections, in my opinion. What does democracy mean? It means elections where the people vote for their leadership. Where the people, again, we'll come back to definitions of the people. Back in 1917, when Woodrow Wilson led the United States into World War I, he had a slogan. It was, "Make the world safe for democracy." That was how he wanted to sell the war. And believe me, he was selling the war, right? You got to remember, the United States declared war on Germany in World War I. We entered that war voluntarily. So Wilson, President of the United States, politician, had to sell the war. How did he sell it? Make the world safe for democracy. That was his slogan. And yet in 1917, women couldn't vote in the United States. African Americans were being lynched for trying to vote in many American states. Native Americans were having their children snatched from them and sent to these huge boarding schools where they were prohibited from speaking their language. In no way, shape, or form would we call that America. We're out there on the crusade, make the world safe for democracy. There's no way we would call that America democracy today. That's my point. Perhaps my main point is that the word changes its meaning. It becomes more. In other words, implied in the word democracy is that it's aspirational. By that I mean that we are not ever a perfect democracy. We are striving towards democracy today. In fact, some would say here in 2020 that our democracy is under more threat than ever. I think it's important to understand that democracy has conquered the world. Even the most obnoxious authoritarian regimes claim to be democracies. It's very interesting. Even North Korea, which on the rankings of countries according to democracy, how much you have or how little you have is at the bottom, claims to be a democracy, holds elections. Now they're fraudulent from start to from beginning to end. But it's interesting, isn't it, that that regime finds it's necessary to pretend that it's a democracy. Everyone pretends they're a democracy. It's very interesting that democracy has conquered the world like that. Also, again, democracy is elections. What do we mean by that? Well, political scientists always talk about the 3 F's of democratic elections: free, fair, and frequent. Now, free means, of course, that anyone can run for office, anyone can form a political party and put candidates up for office. Fair means the votes are counted honestly and the results are reported honestly. And also, free and fair mean that basic human rights, as enshrined in our Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, are honored during elections. That the government doesn't attempt to stifle the free exchange of ideas during elections. And then frequent, of course, is that elections are held on a regular basis. There's no elections for life. There's no one election and that's it. Elections are held frequently. Another point about democracy that I think a lot of people miss is that in a democratic election, it's one man, one vote. There is an equality built into democracy. In other words, I have the same vote as Bill Gates, the billionaire. One man, one vote. Now, it doesn't take much imagination then to understand that democracy is involved in ideas of equality. Equality. One man, one vote. So, one of the definitions of democracy is that it's involved with ideas of social equality, not just political equality, but social equality. Inherent in the idea of democracy is not just one man, one vote, but also civil rights, human rights. Again, as enshrined in our Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, but as is still being perfected today. Again, democracy is a journey. Of the 27 amendments to the Constitution, and let's eliminate the first 10, they're automatic, the Bill of Rights. Of the 17 remaining amendments to the Constitution, 4 of them concern expansion of the right to vote. The 15th prohibits racial discrimination in voting. The 19th, enfranchised women. The 22nd, no poll tax. And the 24th, 18-year-old vote. It's a thread. And I think it's implied in the very concept of democracy. Equality. Equality. Now, of course, that brings us to consideration of the 14th Amendment, right? My favorite amendment. Oh, I like the First Amendment, who doesn't? But the 14th Amendment is underappreciated by Americans, where the federal government is pledged in the 14th Amendment to enforce equal protection of the laws. Federal government doesn't have any choice. The 14th Amendment commands the federal government to enforce equal protection of the laws. Whoa, right? Most Americans don't get it. Now, the federal government has been absent in that quest for a lot of time since the 14th Amendment was adopted in 1868. The federal government has not lived up to its charge to enforce equal protection of the laws. One of the key aspects of equal protection of the laws is the right to vote. Now, in the original Constitution, enacted in 1787 in Philadelphia, voting rights were left to the states. That changed after the Civil War with the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, which explicitly says that you can't be denied the right to vote based on race. And by the way, the 15th Amendment's the only place where that word appears in our Constitution, R-A-C-E. Now, of course, how can you have a 15th Amendment, a 14th Amendment, and a 15th Amendment enacted after the Civil War, and by 1900 have most African Americans disenfranchised, not be allowed to vote, and indeed sometimes lynched for trying to vote? How can that happen? Well, that's a good question, right? Sometimes governments don't live up to their responsibilities. One of the great things to say about the United States of America is that finally, right, with the Civil Rights Movement after World War II, Martin Luther King, with the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the government started to take its responsibility, equal protection of the laws, more seriously. It's an aspect of American history that a lot of Americans don't appreciate. Equality, right? Democracy and equality go together. The federal government is charged, let me repeat this, with enforcing equal protection of the laws. Boiled down, democracy pretty much equals elections. Free, fair, and frequent elections. For most of my life, almost 70 years, Americans have been pretty blasé about elections. We've sort of taken our elections for granted. It seems not anymore, not in 2020, which might be a good thing. Elections can fail. We had a failed election in this country in 1860. And most historians think of the failed election of 1860 as the proximate cause of the Civil War. Not the deeper underlying cause, that of course was slavery. But the proximate cause was a failed election, and that half the country decided not to honor the results of the election. Again, Americans tend to be blasé about elections. Elections can be very dangerous. Look at the country of Belarus right now. A long-time dictator held a fraudulent election, and the people went into the streets and are still there. Hopefully the people will force his abdication and repudiate his fraudulent pretend election. Isn't it interesting? Even fake pretend democracy can be powerful. Some political scientists see democracy as the political system of the middle class. Of course, when we talk about the middle class, we introduce the concept of socio-economic class, a very complicated subject historically. But I think most people sign into the idea that there is such a thing as class, and that it helps explain the reality we live in, the idea of socioeconomic class. And a lot of political scientists think that when the middle class rules, they want democracy. They want to vote on their leadership. Simplistically, it sort of goes that monarchy, aristocracy, is the form of government of the rich, the powerful, when they rule. Democracy, the form of government of the middle class, and some form of dictatorship, some form of tyranny, is when the poor or the marginalized grab power. That doesn't happen very often. But that's sort of the way it's broken down. So democracy is the government when the middle class attains power. Likewise, a lot of historians think the middle class attained power with the rise of the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s. The Industrial Revolution, a very interesting and important concept. When you talk about the Industrial Revolution, you're talking about the rise of technology. Some people have put it as the rise of the machine. And we're still in the Industrial Revolution. It's still ongoing, over 200 years of industrial development, also known as modernization. You can come to the conclusion that the middle class rose because of technological advancement, and democracy rose with technological development. So democracy is dependent upon modernization, and it rises when countries or regions modernize, when technology rises, productivity rises. If you're going to claim that the rise of the middle class promotes democracy, then a decline in the middle class would bring democracy into doubt. Again, it's important to understand that the meaning of democracy has changed. The fact is that the term democracy was reviled by our founding fathers. They equated it with mob rule. They were Republicans, our founding fathers. They believed in a Republican form of government, republicanism. As noted before, the two terms, Republican and democracy, Republic and democracy, are now fused. There is no distinction between them. The Constitution of the United States, as written in that room in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, is in many ways anti-democratic. It's important to know that about our original document. Of course, primarily, it was a pro-slavery document. It wasn't anti-slavery. Perhaps it had anti-slave implications, ultimately. It wasn't neutral. It was pro-slavery, the original Constitution. That obviously disqualifies the government set up under it as a democracy. The Electoral College is another anti-democratic aspect of the original Constitution. It's clear that the Electoral College was put in by slave owners to enhance their power electorally. That's just a fact, all right? That the Electoral College has survived once slavery was gone is a democratic abomination. The Electoral College is anti-democratic. It should be done away with, in my opinion. As was mentioned earlier, the right to vote is key to a democracy. 4 of the 17 amendments, taking out the Bill of Rights, to the Constitution expand the right to vote. It's a theme, it's a line of progression in our Constitution, the right to vote. Now, I remember years ago when the late Supreme Court Justice Anton Scalia, noted conservative, said that there was no right to vote in the U.S. Constitution, in his opinion. That's utter nonsense. Again, all 4 of the amendments that expand voting rights have the phrase, the right of the citizens of the United States to vote. 4 amendments have that verbiage. How can anyone say that there's not a right to vote in the Constitution of the United States? There most certainly is. And here in 2020, right, with the election coming up, as I sit here today, in a few weeks, the right to vote is on everyone's mind, especially considering the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the idea of making voting safe in a pandemic, and the use of mail-in ballots, which of course go back decades, mail-in ballots. There's several states, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, who've been exclusively using mail-in ballots for decades. No problems. There are political scientists who think that everyone in the country should vote by mail-in all the time, that that's the best way to vote. And yet, that's a real topic of conversation here in 2020. Again, someone who believes in democracy, and all Americans are supposed to believe in democracy, right? Anyone who believes in democracy should believe in making voting easy and safe. Both communism, and by that I mean Marxist-Leninism and Maoism, and hardcore fascism, Mussolini, Hitler, Franco in Spain, hate democracy. If you want to think of the political spectrum, left to right, communism, fascism, the two poles, they agree on one thing. They hate democracy. Communists, they think that democracy is just a facade for hardcore authoritarian capitalism. Communists believe there is no democracy, that all democracy is fake, a put-up job by the rich to fool the people into thinking they have a say in the government. Your hardcore commie would say, oh yeah, you believers in democracy, go to the polls someday and vote in a real capitalist reformer and see how long your little democracy lasts. Fascists, on the other hand, hate democracy because it gets in the way of the romance of the leader. Fascism is the cult of the leader, and you don't elect a fascist leader. The fascist leader mystically arises out of the people and is recognized by everyone as the leader. So obviously you don't elect a fascist leader. Now fascist Hitler himself came to power as a result of an election. With a fascist, of course, if you elect one, from the very first day they assume power, they will try to make sure that that election is the last one you're going to have. Fascists think democracy is for the weak. Fascists think democracy is for milquetoast people, true nationalists, true citizens. Don't vote for their leaders. They recognize the leader through, and again, I know this sounds kind of preposterous, through some sort of mystical attachment between the leader and the people.